Okay, it's preparing to live stream. Hello, everybody. Dr. D is with me in the house to talk tonight about the psychological aspects of Jyotish, as well as the astrologer's shadow. And while we're getting all set up, I'm going to copy and paste some links in for our friends on Facebook so that they can join the festivities here. First of all, welcome, Dennis. It's been a bit of time since our last conversation. Hope things have been well in your universe. How are things going?
Oh, good. It's great to be here. Thanks, Michael, for inviting me.
Oh, thank you. It's always a pleasure to have you on and just have so many long, deep discussions about various aspects of astrology, mythology, and life in general. So, do you want to share with our viewers tonight the main things that you wanted to kind of talk about? I know we're going to kind of have a bit of a discussion and back and forth about some things we discuss, but I'd love to, just kind of let you roll for a second with things.
Sure. Yeah, I thought it would be good to start out by talking about some of the psychological aspects that we see in the natal chart primarily, but also they're influenced by the dashas as well as the transits. So I thought we could start out by talking about that. I wanted to get into the whole concept of the astrologer's shadow too, which we can address. And another area that really kind of creates challenges sometimes in the consulting room for astrologers is difficult client styles that sometimes will present themselves and how to work with those, and just to be aware of those as you're sometimes that are pitfalls in practice. So those are some of the things. And then I'd love to get into talking a little bit about the Nakshatras and mythology and how that can play a role in the healing process as well. So, but I'd
You
love
want
to have a discussion between you because I love our interactions and I learned so much from you as well. So feel
Oh,
free to
most wonderful.
interject.
Thank you. Thank you. Why don't we start with the Nakshatras? I think that that's, a really powerful point. If I can kind of chip in something, and there's been some, our colleague Ernst Wilhelm released a new translation of Taittiriya Brahmana that really is just which is an ancient text that contains some sutras on the nakshatras, and it's presented as just a translation rather than a translation with commentary, with several different meanings of each word that's involved. And I've actually found this to be really wonderful because it's helping me to discover and unravel so many new psychological aspects of the nakshatras that I never really thought of before. And something I kind of want to toss into the conversation is how each nakshatra has so many different aspects that are involved in it, just as we each have several different aspects. And with each of these sutras from Taittiriya Brahmana, with the exception of two, it's spoken about how the power of the nakshatra is of a specific deity.
Right.
Now, that's pretty important because that's a power that comes directly from God. And then it goes into talking about how one aspect of that power is from above, and one aspect of that power is from below, which very clearly kind of covers the whole concept of being an individual incarnated, but at the same time having this divine aspect to one's particular consciousness. Two of those nakshatras, which are actually Punarvasu and Mula, it says for the deity rather than of the deity. So
Interesting.
for Aditi, which is Punarvasu, and for Nariti, which is Mula. And there's some really interesting concepts there because Punarvasu is a very nourishing nakshatra. So for Aditi, the mother of the demigods, there's this nourishing of the individual. And for Nariti, whose dissolution and destruction, there's this confrontation with the ego, which brings one to a deeper level of awareness, which can shift one's spiritual path towards more focused away from the individual ego concept of where one needs to move in association with things. And so primarily what I find really interesting about the Nakshatras in this particular concept is that these powers are not something that's separate from us. They're something that's within us, and they're divine energies.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the Rig Veda, there was never a listing of the nakshatras. It came later in the Tarva Veda and the Yajur Vedas, the later Veda. But according to David Frawley, all the deities, are present in the Rig Veda, all the deities of the nakshatras. So there are a few that are mentioned, but I think instead of Pusha, Tisha, a few others are mentioned in the Rig Veda, but not the whole list of 27. And so you bring up a really good point in that I think part of it is nakshatra means to guard or protect. It's like these deities that are helping to help us navigate through life. And we need to befriend them. Carl Jung, the famous psychiatrist, had this statement that the gods and goddesses no longer live on Olympus. They live in our bodies as disease and our minds as complexes. So the goal of archetypal therapy, or we could say archetypal astrology, is to feed the god or the goddess and to own that divinity. It's interesting because it kind of ties into the whole concept of shadow too, in the sense that the shadow is kind of those unconscious parts of ourselves that we haven't really owned. Most people think of the shadow as just the negative or the difficult aspects, which is a big part of the shadow.
Yeah.
But there's also what's called the light shadow. And this is kind of what you're alluding to, I think, is that the light shadow is the divine nature that we've projected onto the gods and goddesses or onto our guru or onto great people, our love of our life. But we need to reclaim that divinity. We need to reclaim that divine light. And so the goal of psychology and astrology is the same. It's to make the unconscious conscious so that then we can move with that awareness, that state of being.
I mean, think about how much modern society has celebrities and people that we like to put up on a pedestal. And we're putting those individuals up on a pedestal either in a good way as something that we worship or in a bad way as something that we abhor. But how unwilling are we to acknowledge and accept both of those sides of ourselves? Right? How willing are we to make ourselves our own quote unquote inner celebrity, so to speak, right? And how willing are we to accept our own negativity, so to speak? Because we all have those individual aspects of ourselves, and that's actually one of the really wonderful things that I appreciate about the concept of the nakshatras, the concept of gods in Hinduism in general, is different types of energies. The gods are given very human aspects too. They get angry, right? They get upset. They do things for which they have recompense. All those things just, naturally tend to happen. And I think there's a message there for us that we quite often tend to really miss in our day-to-day existence. And I don't know, we just tend to understand it. Yeah, to misunderstand it, I meant to say. So
yeah, there's those qualities of the nakshatras, like the ugra ones, the fierce ones, the
exactly
nakshatras, and the tikshna, the sharp ones, that are.
And that's interesting too, because another interesting discussion is that we tend to get lost in these concepts of ugra or fierce as being like bad.
Right.
Or if a planet is cruel or considered violent, that's bad. But let's say you've got a lesion on your brain or something, right? You're going to need some really intense, equally violent measures in order to remove that lesion. So in some areas that intensity, that forceful energy is very necessary. I was actually just talking about this on one of my videos yesterday, which was, about Ashlesha Nakshatra, and how Ashlesha Nakshatra has this very, intense, sharp energy and very hard. But sometimes that's very necessary, because sometimes we have to be decisive.
Mm-hmm.
And how that decisiveness or that harshness comes out is really up to our own particular choice. We can let it build up because we've repressed it, and then we tend to lash out. Or we can choose instead to be aware of how we can use that constructively, such as, okay, I'm not going to repress this situation anymore. This is something I don't want in my life. So I'm very firmly and strongly going to say no, because it's not right that this continues. This needs to change. And in some
Yes.
instances, those changes are not just for us, they're equally for the other individual too. And we tend to, think of nakshatras, when they're given the indication of being ugra or fierce or violent, as being somehow negative. And I could probably, if I had like a dime for every time somebody has said to me, I've got this nakshatra and I've heard that it's really bad,
Right.
I would probably be filthy rich right now.
It's interesting because the great Saint Yogananda had rising and moon in Ugra Magha, the mighty one. And
Right.
yet he considered himself a kshatriya, even though he was a Brahmin as well, but he was a spiritual warrior. And so he had to come, to the United States and deal with, the society here, and he had to even deal with the Ku Klux Klan and things like
I didn't
that.
know that. Wow.
In the movie Awake, it talks about this. So he had to be a spiritual warrior. He had to have that fierce energy, like you say. It's interesting you talked about Ashlesha too, because we have us people with Ashlesha have the challenge right now with Rahu transiting through Ashlesha.
Most definitely.
Much right in the middle of Ashlesha as we speak. So it's really testing people with Ashlesha, moon or planets or rising sign, to be responsive rather than reactive.
I think that's what it's all about. It's with all of the fierce and intense nakshatras, it's about being responsive. Yeah.
And being empowering rather than controlling, and choosing to be effective versus being right.
Most definitely. But bringing it back to the psychological, let's talk a little bit about applying these. I know we've already kind of discussed the concept of these energies not being outside of us. And some keys that I find in understanding the nakshatras is, obviously the nakshatras are considered the wives of the moon. And if we understand the moon as being related to us as individuals, the moon is our consciousness, or it's our sensory mind. It's our subjective way of looking at things. And the moon also relates to how we grow the particular things in our life. And it's no coincidence that the moon is so deeply tied into the cycles of the tides. If you look in the Farmer's Almanac, it's considered very important, whether it's a full moon or new moon, for a lot of different things. So the moon is very deeply tied into growth. Whether we're aware and perceiving things in clarity, or whether we're perceiving things from in a clouded manner, such as if the moon is somewhat weak or waning in our chart. And so all these powers of God are not separate from us, and they're given to us to grow our consciousness, to grow in greater awareness. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on some of that.
Well, it's interesting because probably one of the most important psychological, emotional, mental factors in the chart is the moon. And if you think about it, what does the moon symbolize? It symbolizes those areas, but it also symbolizes the mother.
Most definitely.
The mother quite often is the chief, conditioning factor in a child's, infancy and in their early years of life. And so depending on how the moon is placed, and if there are challenges, like you said, if the moon is more waxing or brighter, it generally is, all things being equal, tends to be a little easier energy to work with rather than a Balsamic or a dark moon, Amavasya moon. But the idea is that the moon, because it reflects the mother, would reflect the early conditioning. So one psychiatrist that I met once, he told me that after doing psychotherapy for 30 years, he learned nothing else from his clients is as we see our mother, we see the world. So the moon is the planet of perception and it is connected with memory in the past and how we project our past onto the present moment and how it colors that so strongly. So when I look at a chart, probably the two psychological factors in terms of planetary energies that I look at are the moon and Mercury, because they're the planets of the mind, and moon particularly more connected also with the emotional nature as well. So those are two things that I look at for, quote, challenges as well as the strengths. I think one of the important factors in doing counseling work and doing astrological work is to build on the strengths, to see the areas in the chart that are strong, and then to point out the challenges, but do it in a way that is empowering to the client. So we can look at the moon in terms of the moon nakshatra, the moon, of course, sign, the placement in terms of houses, and then aspects made to it. We often find the moon with, if there are strong Saturn aspects to the moon, is it can, not always, but it can reflect kind of a melancholy mind, or sometimes issues with depression. Say if the moon is aspected within a few degrees of Saturn, sometimes it will bring this aspect in terms of psychological challenge. Whereas the moon with Rahu, tends to bring a little bit more emotional turbulence. Sometimes, not to label, but again, sometimes with like bipolar disorder, there can be sometimes a moon Rahu conjunction. I find this to be true.
Can I interject there? I have noticed with Rahu moon conjunctions the tendency for the individual to do either or both of these, which is to conceal their emotions from other people, or to be prone to hiding from their own emotions. And it's not always a conscious thing. I think that very much ties in with what you're speaking about in terms of bipolar. Yeah.
Sometimes also in terms of the houses, probably the two houses that are the most important psychologically are the first house, because it's the stamba, the root or the pillar on which the chart is built, really, and the ruler of the ascendant, where that's placed. And then the other house that's really important is the fourth house.
Well, most definitely. With
emotional happiness, contentment, things like that as well. So those are a couple of areas that I tend to focus on a little bit more in terms of psychological aspects. The sun reflects the father, particularly for day births. So also, if there's challenges with the sun, that may indicate issues with the father. I've often seen with sun in Libra as a general rule, for example, in its Nietzsche sign or debilitated sign, that quite often the father can be absent. Or even if the father was present, sometimes they're not available. And again, some of these factors that I'm talking about, maybe 80% of the time have relevance. There's always the the difference of,
most definitely,
how karmas play out. But sometimes the person really needs to become their own father to themselves at a very strong level.
Yeah.
So those are some of the factors that I'm seeing, and then again, they get activated more during the dashas, of course. Good example of this is the famous Albert Einstein, who is considered the man of the century from Time magazine, in terms of the 20th century. He had a debilitated moon and Mercury in his chart. Moon being in the sign of Scorpio and Jyeshta, which is a little bit of a tricky nakshatra to work with sometimes in Scorpio. And then his Mercury was in Pisces. And the idea is that when he went through his moon Mercury Mahadasha and Bhukti or subcycle, he had a nervous breakdown and he had to leave his position at the university that he was teaching at. So the karma came during that period, and he had to step back from some of his duties, in terms of worldly duties, and to really work on healing himself.
Hmm. That's interesting. So, a question for you: Would you do you find you use the 12th house in your analysis a lot in terms of understanding subconscious or unconscious impulses that might be present?
Yeah, I was thinking in terms of the Dushtana houses, the 8th and the 12th houses tend to be more also connected with psychological issues. The 12th house I think of as the womb, and it can be the whole
That makes
environment
sense.
that was going on, during the pregnancy. Uh, and if there's challenging planets in the 12th house, sometimes I've found that there can be negative womb experiences associated.
How much of that do you think is because the 12th can also be related to the past? So it's an interesting concept of the 12th house being things that go on in the womb, because I think that that would be very directly connected to what was going on in the individual's past life and the conditioning that they were needing to experience coming into being for this particular lifetime.
Yeah, I think that's true. And in some of the books, actually, I call it the womb and the tomb because it can indicate the ending of life as well. So
Most
the 12th
definitely.
house is very interesting in that sense. And of course, the whole chart is reflecting our past life karma, our prarabdha karma. But I think you're right. I think it definitely is a strong indicator, again, of the shadow, of the unconscious parts of the self. I would say the 8th house as well can reflect those aspects that are unconscious.
Hmm. Hmm. So, something, since we're on the topic of karma, an interesting thing, and we were kind of discussing this before we went live with this, which is the whole concept of karma and the astrologer's role with the client in regard to karma. Um, and mainly along these lines, I think what I was wanting to bring into the discussion, I'd love to obviously hear your thoughts on all of this too, which is how careful we have to be as astrologers in terms of our advice, because we have a responsibility in terms of our advice. We say things, especially I'm going to say it, and I don't mean this in an arrogant manner in any way whatsoever. As a matter of fact, I just think I'm a guy with a webcam, right? But the point I'm making is the more people tend to notice us as astrologers, the more they tend to come to us as individuals. And then, therefore, on a certain level, the greater our responsibility becomes. And I know you were talking about another level of this, which is the concept of inflation of the ego and how there can be a tendency potentially for the astrologer to become somewhat narcissistic in relation to this. And really, the more clients who come to us, the more humble we have to become, because as individuals, and especially as astrologers, we're just individuals. None of us are self-realized. We're not like these perfected beings. We're individuals who have a gift, just as somebody with a hammer and the capacity to hammer it into a piece of wood really well has a gift for being a carpenter. We have a gift for being able to tap into horoscopes, but that gift is not going to function in 100% efficiency 100% of the time, nor was it necessarily intended to. Um, as astrologers, we can tap into the energies, we can look at the planets, we can understand those things, but ultimately we're human. And in some instances, our insight is going to fall short. In addition to that, we have a great responsibility for the words that come out of our mouth, because the manner in which those words come out of our mouth is going to affect the individual that we're talking to. The words that we choose to express ourselves are going to impact the individual. The trust that the individual places in us as an astrologer when we're coming out of with those words becomes even more intensified. And so we have to be really careful the way that we get involved and the manner in which we give advice to individuals, which doesn't mean that we necessarily shouldn't give advice to individuals. I tend to feel that a lot of the astrologer's responsibility is to present and I'm going to choose my words carefully, the truth as the astrologer is able to see it.
Yeah.
Right. With their limited capacity. The truth is the astrologer is able to see it and to help to empower the individual to make choices based upon the information that's being presented to the individual.
Yeah, I call it, I coined the term chart side manner rather than bedside manner doctors. So we have to have good chart side manner. And, it's part of the issue is, I think astrologers need to have more skill and get training in counseling skills and, like you're saying, communication skills. Because you can have all the insight and have, all the astrological knowledge and wisdom, but if you can't present the information in a way that's empowering to the client, I really think it's not meaningless, but it's somewhat limited, and you can do some harm. Sometimes I feel like I call it the 3Ds. We have to be careful with prediction. I call it death, divorce, and disease. I think we have to be careful. And we were talking about this before we went on, that as astrologers, we are taking on a certain amount of karma with our clients. Very, very karmic kind of profession on a lot of different ways. And so we have to be careful, again, in terms of making predictions. I think we need to do it with a sense of humility and compassion. And a good astrologer, as far as I can see, is the great ones are choice revealers rather than choice makers.
Definitely. Yes.
Because, again, to reveal and to allow the client to really come to the decision, almost like leading them to water, but you can't make them drink.
No.
They have to make that choice to drink of the water that may be helpful for them. So I think we have to be careful in terms of, again, getting too much into playing God with our clients. I think this is the biggest part of the astrologer's shadow is that when we become inflated, when we become, as you were saying, narcissistic, when we really, sometimes it's when we're really doing good work, we feel like we get to this state of consciousness where we feel we're omniscient and omnipresent. And this is usually the pride before the fall, quite often. So we have to be careful about not getting too inflated and playing God with our clients, because we will take on quite a bit of karma when we're doing that, we're playing that role.
Most definitely, and I'm always very big on telling the client that I'm just an astrologer, right? And I think we have to keep that humility that is there. Just as you can give accurate predictions to an individual, you can just as easily fall short of the mark. And I often joke with clients that it's the astrologer's excuse. But it's actually not really an excuse. It's the truth. Sometimes astrologers are destined to give an incorrect prediction. It's just the way it is. You can sit there with your software. You can scan over the person's situation, 95 times, going over it with the fine-tooth comb, and still you can make a wrong prediction. Mm-hmm. Because you are a human and you have human frailties. And I often jokingly say, that's my excuse and I'm sticking with it. But in reality, it's a truth. If God wants us to fail, we fail as individuals.
It's very humbling. Chakrapani Ulal, who has really been my spiritual father this lifetime and Jyotish guru, we could say, he in a recent talk he gave a couple of years ago, and he just passed away recently, 2 months ago. But what a great soul. And he said that 25% of the equation of doing good astrology is information and knowledge and our wisdom in terms of our study. And then 25% of it is intuition. And then 50% of the equation is the grace of God and Goddess.
Oh, most definitely.
And so 25% being intuition, 50% being the grace. I call it Graceland, where we learn our techniques. We have all these things down. We have the hammer, to do the work, but yet the intuition and the grace, the divine grace, needs to flow in. Most effective astrologers are really tied into that truth.
Oh, and let's face it, that other 25% of the intuition, the other 25% of the skills wouldn't be there if it wasn't for that other 50% that we're talking about. So really it's 100% of it.
Yeah. I like to think that our will, when it's aligned with the divine will, then it becomes fully manifest.
Most definitely. Most definitely. So we had some other things written down that we wanted to kind of talk about. One thing I wanted to discuss with you today is the whole concept of what versus why, right? And since we're on the topic of prediction, maybe it's a good segue into talking about that, which is really on many levels. Sure, us astrologers give people predictions. As we've been saying, you have to be very careful with predictions because we're humans, ultimately we stand the potential of failing. But I'm of the mindset that really with prediction, and it's not that it's necessarily a bad thing, but I think that we're looking at more of the what's of the situation. And we're really looking at more of the symptoms that are related to an underlying deep-seated karmic, I'm going to use the word anomaly because I don't want to give it this word issue or anything like that, because we all have karma. And it's not always necessarily that it's an issue. It's something that's there for a reason, I think. And so we can deal with all the what's, but those what's are just a symptom of the why, which is underneath that what. And so if we don't get to the root understanding of the issue behind the situation, then we tend to really miss things. That's why I think understanding Rahu and Ketu in an individual's chart is very important. I find, in every single reading, regardless of what an individual is coming to me for, regardless of whether they're asking for a prediction, this, that, or the other thing, I'm going to look at Rahu and Ketu in their chart because I want to see the underlying karma behind the situation. Mm-hmm. Why that is there? What does the soul have to gain from that particular experience of either not getting married, or what does that soul have to gain from that experience of B, getting married? What's there to gain from it? What's there to learn from it? Because the other things that just occur in our life, they're symptoms of the underlying things that are there. They're the karma bearing fruit in a certain way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I find again with Rahu, it's 9 times out of 10, it's a challenging aspect in the chart. But the challenge, if like you said, if the why is understood of what that challenge is, then person can move with that. I've found, for example, and this is maybe just my practice, my seeing thousands of clients, but let's just say hypothetically Rahu's in the 7th house. I find quite often an early marriage will end in divorce. Now, we could say from the point of view of, how would you say, dualistic life, usually that's a bad situation. It's not something we would want to go through from the ego point of view. And yet, that may be beautiful aspect of learning and really owning one's shadow side, because quite often we project our negativity onto our partner. And that's a challenge of being able to reclaim those projections. So,
and it's interesting you bring that particular example up, because Ketu in the 1st house is going to, from my experience, is going to make the individual tend to have this, I want to use the phrase self-controlled, which can sometimes be positive, but can sometimes have an overly self-controlled aspect to it. So since the focus with K2 in the 1st is upon self, and that's what the individual is most accustomed to, I'm most accustomed to understanding myself. When you put them in the environment of a relationship, since the focus is upon self, the natural mirror of that, because they're viewing the world through their own lens, is that because I am seeing myself as this way, that way, or the other way, other people might be watching me.
Mhm.
So individuals with that placement, I find they tend to get really uncomfortable in their relationships, and it becomes a thing of, if they want the relationship to be successful, to develop and work on the skills of being able to relax into the relationship. Because until they get into the space where they're able to kind of let their guard down a little bit, they're going to tend to invite people into their life who tend to be much more chaotic and out of
Right.
control and things
Yeah.
like that. But the moment that they begin to kind of go, I don't need to be so self-controlled inside of myself, I can relax a little bit and know when to harness my self-control and when to be more relaxed into the situation, then they'll tend to attract more relationships that are a little more balanced in their life.
Yeah, I like to say that with that aspect, it's kind of moving from a melodrama to a melodrama. You know,
Exactly. Yes, most
K2 in
definitely.
the first, you know, too. I mean, and again, when I say these things, I say them with love, you know, and compassion. And just because you have that access with the nodes doesn't mean your marital life is doomed. It just
Oh, definitely. Most
indicates,
definitely.
as you're saying, not to pick someone too that's too erratic,
Yes.
that's too unpredictable. Uh, and K2 in the first, sometimes the person can feel a little bit like a stranger in a strange land, you know,
Most definitely.
and
Yes.
you know, again, some confusion about who they are, and so they may pick partners that that are a little bit out of control and that are kind of rajasic in their nature, kind of Rahu-like in terms of their intensity.
Most definitely. Most definitely. But that's why I think it's so important to understand the whys in the situation, because people most of the time, and I can't say it one. I consider myself really fortunate as an astrologer, because I tend to attract clientele who really want to be more deeply self-aware, right? Which isn't, that may come across as a criticism of people who just want to know prediction. It's not, but I think it's so important to understand the reasoning behind why you're having a problem with something. And one thing I encounter is, I know you mentioned wanting to talk about, the different types of clients, but one of the things that I tend to encounter quite a lot are individuals who may come to me in their late 20s, and they're frustrated because they haven't figured out what they want to do for the rest of their lives yet.
Mm-hmm.
And they look around and they see everybody else who they're judging as, being in that place, but that's not always the case, right? Some of those people haven't really figured out what they're wanting to do. But we tend to have all this, for lack of a better way to put it, societal conditioning, and in many cases, cultural conditioning too, that places upon us this stigma if we're not like a successful business person by the age of 25, or if we're not married by the time we're 22, or if we don't have children by this age. And we tend to forget that even though all those things may be existent in society, they're not the actual judgment of the successful fulfillment of a soul's path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because each soul's path is going to be very vastly different. Some people aren't made for a married lifestyle. Some people, some people you can find they're able to have very successful relationships with other individuals, but the moment that marriage comes into the equation, that's it.
You know, it's interesting. One of my teachers from India, who was a great Jyotishi, he was actually he was a disciple of Sri Yukteswar, the great
Mm-hmm.
astrologer that was
Right.
Jagannath Guru,
Yeah.
and he would often see in a chart. Let's just say, for example, Rahu Mars are in the sign of Cancer. Let's just say in the seventh house, where it would be difficult marital karma. And usually with difficult karmas, you'll see them 2 or 3 times showing up once, it's probable. Twice, it's more likely. And if I see something 3 times, it may be more fixed karma.
Yeah.
So let's just say that's kind of fixed karma that an early marriage could end in divorce. So one of the ways to work around that is to, as he would say, to have a spiritual marriage. That the 7th house is contracts. So it's legal binding contracts. So it's a business partnership, really. So the idea is that to circumvent some of that karma, you may want to move more, towards a spiritual type marriage and not have to sign a legal binding contract. Give you an example of Yogananda too, was that he was told by his astrologer in his village where he grew up that he would be married 3 times and twice a widower. And he took his chart and he wadded it up and he threw it into a fire. And he said, the seeds of my past karma cannot grow in the fires of divine wisdom. But on 3 occasions, his family tried to get him married to 3 different women and he had to refuse. And so is his chapter in Autobiography of the Yogis called Outwitting the Stars.
Right.
He was able to circumvent that karma because he wanted to be married to Divine Mother. And then even in his chart, there's just some difficult aspects in his chart. Venus in Scorpio, the ruler of his 7th house, Saturn, being in the 2nd house, which actually sometimes when the ruler of the 7th is in the 2nd house, it can indicate several marriages. So the astrologer wasn't totally off, but again, his prediction was so definite that, Yogananda actually wanted to overcome the karmas of that and to rise to a different level with that karmic configuration.
And that fits in absolutely perfectly, which is sometimes as astrologers, we give wrong predictions, but it's for a very definite reason, because
Well, it activated that spiritual warrior quality of Yogananda
Exactly.
very strongly. Yeah.
Exactly. And so sometimes a wrong prediction can be very positive on many levels, and I think that it's important to acknowledge that. It's important to acknowledge that, and to be aware of that, both as individuals and as astrologers. You had mentioned wanting to talk about astrologers and narcissism. I think would you
Wait,
would
just
you
one second.
That's fine, no worries.
Can I come back? I'm with a client. Sorry. Half an hour? Maybe in an hour. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. It's no problem. We're humans. But no, I wanted to kind of discuss that a little bit and hear your opinion on all of that.
Yeah, I would say that, again, we just have to be real susceptible. We're susceptible as astrologers to having to wear what I call the cloak of competence. I mean, if you read Vajramira, his qualities of a Jyotishi, I mean, it's really intimidating how much we need to carry on. So the idea is that as astrologers, sometimes we have to wear this cloak of all knowing, all seeing. So again, that can lead itself to narcissism. Also, I find that one of the things that's very humbling is that clients that come to us quite often can be a reflection of our own process. Sometimes I find that, a certain issue that I'm working through, a client will appear that has that same issue. And so it really forces me, sometimes in a very humble way, to realize that that's something that I need to heal within myself as well.
Most definitely. I find that happens, just speaking my own side of that, and then I would love to hear further of your thoughts on that. I find the more I get involved in not taking the time to deal with my own personal processes, then the more that the universe, God, whatever it is you want to call it, places me in situations where a client will come to me that reflects that particular aspect of it. And it's almost like God going, okay, well, since you're not going to take a break, I'm going to make you work through this anyway by placing this person in your path so that you have to take a look at it. And at
Mhm.
least in that manner, you're going to hopefully be helping the other person and hopefully helping yourself at the same time. Then you have to be really careful in those situations too, because since it is your own shadow, you have to be careful not confusing your own individual shadow with what the other individual is going through.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting twists and turns with particularly one of the difficult client styles that I find to work with is a client that has borderline personality disorder, which is a kind of a narcissistic personality disorder where they see things as black or white. You're either good or evil. So Carl Jung said it very well. He said that when someone makes you God, the devil's not far behind.
Mm,
So again, that playing that God role, I think, is the main thing that can create the inflation and the narcissism and the
mm,
grandiosity. And this is something that I think we always need to keep held in check. We always need to keep an eye on that, how that can slip in and play a role, you
mm.
know. And
Go
I
ahead.
would
Go ahead.
just say too, as terms of challenging client styles, in my opinion, that's probably the most difficult client style to work with because, again, they can make you omniscient, omnipresent, think you know all and see all, and then can kind of turn and then make you, into the Antichrist, So it's a very, very, very difficult client to work with. And I think one of the things as astrologers that we need to do is to have, of course, this was popular when I was growing up, a Rolodex or a referrals, because when we work with certain clients, unless we have the skill set and the training to work with it, we may be stepping into a minefield. So
Mm,
we need to be aware certain clients that may really benefit from more of a psychotherapeutic approach
mm-hmm.
that's beyond our scope of training. So I think we have to be humble in that way, because when you uncover certain aspects, let's just say physical or sexual abuse may show up, in the chart, and the client tells you this, again, may be on your scope of training to actually do ongoing work with that client unless they're getting that support and that psychological training from someone that's really, expert in
Definitely.
that field.
And I find sometimes if you are in a position where you are uncovering that information in the horoscope and you're talking to the person about it, whilst on one level you're inviting them to discuss it therapeutically, on some levels, if the individual has it inherent in their chart that they have trust related issues anyway, then they can begin to feel that you're in on a secret that they don't always necessarily feel comfortable with you knowing. And unless you're in a position where you know how to kind of handle that as a therapist, it's going to place you in a position where you're inviting that person sometimes to go into their shadow, so to speak, with you. And just as you're saying, they place you in the position of being the antichrist or the abuser or this, that, or the other thing, when in reality, you're not any of those things. And so I do think it's very important at certain times to go, okay, this may be a situation where I need to recommend this person does this or goes to see this person because they're the ones who are more suited for what this person needs as an individual.
Yeah, I kind of think that there's three basic styles of counseling, just on a real general level. One is the informational style, where we used to have to do this sometimes, and these are the sessions I really didn't like doing, where the person just wanted you to make a recording of the session and send it to them without
Mm-hmm.
any interaction whatsoever. They
Oh,
just wanted
goodness.
the straight sauce of what you could
Mm-hmm.
provide. And I always say I'm a psychologist that uses astrology.
Mm-hmm.
So, my interest is more in counseling. So the second style is the counseling style, which involves really, more of an interaction. And I see this style as kind of like a spiritual life coach. is that in some ways what we're doing in terms of trying to really point out the strengths as well as the areas that need to be healed, and really empowering the client and leaving the client with a sense of faith and optimism and hope without cheerleading them off a cliff.
Right.
So
I definitely like that analogy. Yes.
so that's the second style. And then the third, which is kind of rare, is the psychotherapeutic style. And this is more if someone's more trained, in psychological counseling and work like this, particularly transpersonal psychology, which kind of goes beyond the ego. Then I think, again, we have to be careful in doing that work unless we feel that we have the skill set to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, though, that you mentioned the recording bit, because I think there are some instances, unless you are specifically wanting to do a counseling session with the individual, and even in those instances, I have found myself lately, because I found myself in a position where I'm actually able to help my clients more in terms of the time I'm able to give to them if I record rather than doing a face-to-face with them. Mm-hmm. Because what I have found happening in that particular regard, at least within my own personal experience, is that I will connect with the client, and sometimes when you're connecting with the client, the other things that come up are good discussion points, right? Mm-hmm. But I've found myself in a very large number of occasions connecting with the client, and you bring up one specific concept that's in the horoscope, and they kind of go into displacement mode, which is they bring up something else in the horoscope and it distracts your attention towards something else. And it's not necessarily guiding you to what the client is wanting to talk about. I've experienced it more from the perspective of steering you away from what the client is most needing to understand at that particular moment. It's almost like a block is coming up, which whilst on one level, it's important to respect that block because the client may not be willing to go there. It's also the concept of sometimes you go into the situation with them and you end up kind of taking this 90-minute detour around their chart that doesn't bring you to the answer that they're coming to you for in the first place. So I've actually found myself in a position of steering away from doing the person to person. In addition to that, I'll be the first to admit I'm extremely hypersensitive. So I find that if I get into a consultation with another client and there's information that I'm working with them on, I begin to become deeply connected to their individual energy, to the extent that I find myself upon occasion, as you may notice me in our conversation now, I quite often look up, right? Where I become so lost in the ethers if I don't ground, that the only way for me to be there grounded for the clients quite often is to not be connected with them in a session.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah. And I've also had I don't mind admitting this in public, I've also had a few sessions where the client asked me something. It was a direct question in relation to something, and I gave them a clear, honest answer in a supportive manner. But much like what you're saying right now, they perceive me, or you said a few minutes ago, they perceive me as being the abuser, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And then I found myself in a role where somebody on the other end of the spectrum is suddenly yelling at me.
Wow. Yeah. Interesting.
And those are the extreme issues that happen, but they're the issues that have led me to the state of going, I'm much more able to present clear information to a client if I'm doing it by tuning into their chart rather than connecting to them as an individual in that particular manner. Mm-hmm. That being the case, I'm sensitive individual. I like to always offer support. I think of my approach as being very therapeutic, but at the same time, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not I'm not trained in those particular fields. And I recognize my limitations with that, but I find that that's the best way to deal with any limitations that I have in that particular department, aside from, in the most appropriate cases, sending the individual to someone who's trained in that particular scenario.
Okay, no, that makes sense. That makes total sense. Yeah, I wanted to discuss a little bit
Yeah.
what I call challenging client styles,
Hmm.
and this just to be aware of it, not to make the clients wrong or anything, because this is just some generalized client styles that I see that I'm faced with sometimes that are, again, kind of challenging. Probably one of the ones that I find the most difficult is when someone is given a gift of a session to me, especially if they're kind of what I call the skeptic astrologer client, that really, in some ways, they've come to the session a little bit kicking and screaming. It's not something they would have chosen to do.
Oh, you mean
And,
those people that come with their sunglasses on and sit there and they have their sunglasses on and they go, mm-hmm, 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 yeah.
yeah. And usually they don't want any interaction. They just want to hear what you have to say. And I remember having a client like this once, and I was in Chicago, and the client just said, I asked him a couple of questions. He goes, "I don't want to say anything. I just want you to tell me exactly what you see." And it was one of the longest hours of my life, because he was
Definitely.
very skeptical. The second client style that I find interesting, and again, kind of the polar opposite, is the agreeable client. And this is a client that basically, whatever you say, is they kind of see whatever you say as the gospel truth.
Yes.
Again, they can make you into God. And this client sometimes, again, if the predictions don't come to pass, then again, you kind of fall from grace in their eyes.
Yes.
But they'll just sit and nod their head to everything you're saying. So this is usually, because to me, astrology at its best is maybe 80-90% accurate. So when I see a client agreeing with everything I'm saying, it's kind of a little bit of a red light there. There may be some qualities going on with their just this agreeable client style. The other one is rescue me, where they want to be rescued. They want you to have the magic pill that's going to make their life okay, or the magic wand. And again, what I try to do with this client is to make them more involved in becoming how would we put it, really becoming more involved in their healing process, rather than just a passive recipient of a cure. So
Definitely.
to activate them in their healing process. There's also the client that's a professional, that's been to probably 4 or 5 astrologers. I remember one astrologer coming to me, and she had actually a cassette tape. This was a number of years ago, of aspects of all these different astrologers that she had been to, some famous Western astrologers. And she had recorded these different aspects of their sessions. And again, sometimes they can develop kind of a psychic dependency. So I find that client, again, sometimes can be a little bit difficult. And then finally, the victim client, where whatever you present to them, especially if it's difficult things, where they feel somehow God, is punishing them. So again, with that client as well, is trying to get them to turn and take a more aspect of trying to take that victim consciousness and turn it into more of a spiritual warrior consciousness. The other thing is that paranoid personality disorder is really quite often difficult to deal with. We actually even have a group here in Sedona called Paranoids Anonymous. The problem is they never let you know where the meeting's at.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, these are some of the more challenging styles that I see that come. in a
There's
procession.
there's one more I would like to add to your list, which, and by no means am I a perfect astrologer. I have my own individual approach. I have found that it works for me. So it's not me saying I'm a perfect astrologer, but it's the client who comes to you and they're wanting to one up you on the things that you're talking to them about and
Mm-hmm.
prove that your astrological way of working with things is somehow inferior to what they know.
Yeah, I call this the confounder. I forgot to mention that, where they definitely, you know,
With those people, I usually say, well, I jokingly say to them, because it usually helps to kind of break the ice and get them out of it. I just go, well, what are you paying me to come to me
yeah,
for? Right?
no, and
Because
I've
you seem to be able to figure it out yourself. So if that's the case, please do, because you shouldn't be paying me. But if you are asking my advice on something, this is what I would
yeah,
suggest to you based upon what I see.
yeah, it's kind of Stump the Astrologer,
Yeah,
a new game show, and the reality is that 80% of my clients that come to me don't fit these challenging client styles. They really come
definitely.
with a sense of openness and their humility, and they're really wanting help, and they're wanting assistance. And so again, I just wanted to point these out for particularly for astrologers, that sometimes these can be challenging client styles that the astrologer may face.
And something that I would add to that is that when the astrologer gets in narcissistic mode, right? Which I have found from my own personal experience, because sure, I'll be the first to admit something goes well, I'm able to help somebody. One aspect of my ego goes, right? Those are the times I find when you tend to invite in more of those difficult clients.
Yeah, it's kind of the pride before the fall, as we were mentioning.
Exactly. Dennis, I've only got like 10 minutes left. Do you want to take some questions if we can find some questions here?
Sure, that'd be great.
People have been chatting in the chat room, but I'm finding they're all pretty much chatting with each other right now. So let's see if I can scroll through and find a question. And again, people, please, I will state this is not intended to be used for you to ask questions about your own particular horoscope. This is just question for you to ask questions about what we've been talking about in general, or perhaps make a comment. So we'll keep running our mouths here for a few more minutes until we see if somebody has a question for us as individuals. And if you do, please type it in the chat window, because I will read it about it. Right. So let's see what people have. So far, people are typing things like 2018 predictions, happy phase of Saturn and Purva Ashadha. Let's see if we can find something that is more related to the discussions that we're having here in general. Dennis, what's your opinion on how nakshatras influence each other? That's a good astrological discussion. Do you have any thoughts on that?
You mean between two charts?
No, but in the same chart. So, for instance, somebody actually posted the question of nakshatras aspecting each other, but I think that, my opinion in relation to that, it's not necessarily that nakshatras aspect each other. Planets interact with each other, and sometimes planets can influence each other if they share a common dispositor for their nakshatra, things along those lines. Yeah.
Yeah, I find that there can be one thing that shows up sometimes, which creates a bond between the nakshatras, is what you're saying is kind of like a parivartana yoga between
Mm.
the rulers, where let's just say you have Moon in Aslesha and Mercury in Hasta, and Mercury's in a Moon ruled nakshatra, and Moon is in a Mercury ruled nakshatra. So they're exchanging energy. And this quite often creates a bond between the two planetary energies, between the Moon and Mercury in this case.
Mm.
So that can show up as one way that they can interact. Also, I think there's something to Tarabala. I haven't researched this as carefully, but when when a planet is in a nakshatra, and this is more like in relationship compatibility,
Mm-hmm.
when, let's just say your moon again is in Ashwini, and the nakshatras that are 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 from your moon, are considered more favorable. It's called Tarabala, or planetary strength, nakshatra strength, really. And so, because it means the strength of the star.
Yes.
So it's nakshatra strength, excuse me, not planetary strength so much. But this is indicated. So there can even be planets in your own natal chart that may be in that relationship to you. And of course, with electional astrology, it's nice to have the moon in good relationship to your moon nakshatra. So to have it 2, 4, 6, 8, or 9 away from your moon, if that makes sense,
Mm-hmm.
kind of creates more of a harmony there. But again, interaction between the nakshatras, I tend to look a lot at the sun, the moon, and the ascendant nakshatras, and see the interrelationship between those three, and the themes that may be played out in the myths, in the sacred stories associated with the deities. And so those deities may be really important for the person to honor, and to see the interrelationship between those deities. Yeah.
Something I have found interesting well, number one, you brought up Tarabala. One of the things that I really do, because I write these daily lunar scopes that I do, and that actually ends up being one component of it, is the Tara, the particular Tara position that the planet is in from the moon. I find that to be very important in terms of understanding how the energy of a particular event or anything is going to play out in that capacity. But in addition to what you mentioned in terms of planets being in each other's nakshatras, I find it really interesting if you follow the chain of final dispositorship. So for instance, if you say Mercury is in, let's say the moon is in Ashlesha Nakshatra. So then you go see where Mercury is. Let's say Mercury is in Purva Ashadha Nakshatra. You go and look where Venus is. And you follow that chain until it ends with one planet. Mm-hmm. And I find that planet that it ends with is going to be a very vital planet in the individual's life. In the instance that you're mentioning in regards to, say, moon in Ashlesha Nakshatra and Mercury in Hasta, it'll create a chain where it just goes back and forth between those two planets. Correct. And so it really strengthens that connection between those two planets. For instance, I wish I don't remember whose chart it was. I think it was some celebrity, and I was looking at their chart, and everything came down to the sun and the moon. It just kept going back and forth between the sun and the moon. And interestingly enough, in that individual's life, the mother and the father were very important, and also relationships with women in their life were very important. They were like the cornerstone of how they played out the drama of their karma, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that totally makes sense.
Here's a good question somebody's asking. Yeah. Somebody's asking, should astrologers make predictions? Isn't this a way of outsourcing a person's own responsibility over their life?
Well, again, this is where the wording and how you communicate different aspects in the chart can be empowering, and again, can help the client ultimately, like we said, be a choice revealer rather than a choice maker, and let the client have the final say, in terms of what they're going to do with their decisions. So this is where, again, there is a certain strong karmic, configuration that we take on as astrologers making these predictions. So we have to do it with a sense of humility and a sense of compassion. And ultimately, again, just a sense of empowering the client to ultimately make the decision.
Ultimately, that's what it's all about, is empowering the client. I completely agree with that. Let's see if we have one more question here from an individual to answer. And if there's other things you have to share while I'm looking for something for us to answer, please feel free to roll with it.
Well, I think, again, that we're we're moving from a place of, in a way, moving from a place as astrologers from psychopathology to psychomythology, where we're allowing the stories, the sacred stories, the myths, the symbols, the parables that are involved with astrology to really do their work, do their magic in terms of, we could say, like archetypal kind of healing that can occur. And that doesn't mean that the psychological aspects that may need to deal with of quote psychopathology may not need to be addressed as well. But we play an unusual role in kind of being a psychopomp, like Hermes, a messenger.
Yes.
Hopefully a messenger of divine truth that can help the client to maybe take a symbol or a myth or a sacred story and utilize that as a catalyst to really make change in their life in a positive direction.
And I think that that is where the Nakshatras play such a vital role
Mm-hmm.
in astrology, because they really tap us into that. And I completely agree. It's not that you ignore the psychopathology that's there, because that dealing with that is part of dealing with the essence of it too, because sometimes you can't get to the underlying personal mythology aspect of it until you address that, because there's too much interference that's in the way of the individual being able to tap into that. But the nakshatras, they all tell a very individual and very personal story for each individual. One thing I find really wonderful and about the nakshatras, but equally very confounding and annoying, is that they're so elusive.
Mm-hmm.
They're the one aspect in astrology that's very difficult to pin down in any one particular way. And that's great, though, because it leaves it open to the intuition. They're very much related to the more intuitive side of astrology.
I agree. Yes.
Well, Dennis, do you want to, before we part ways, do you want to tell everybody about your website?
Yeah, it's just real simple, just dennisharness.com. And people can connect with me through there.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Dennis. I always enjoy having you on.
It was great, Michael.
Let's connect again sometime soon.
Okay, and New Year blessings to you.
Oh, same to you. Take care of yourself.
Okay. Namaste.
Bye now.